Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing should the Sharks fire head coach Bob Boughner going into the 21-22 season and pick up a different head coach to try and get the Sharks back into the playoffs, or should they keep Bob Boughner and give him, a full training camp, a full preseason to try and get this team back on track for the following year? Well, let's jump right into it and start with a pro and cons list, because while a lot of people feel like Bob Boughner has maybe done a lot of good or others feel like he's done a lot of bad, in reality he falls somewhere in the middle of that. There has been some really solid things he's done for this team, while there have been a lot of things that he has done, or I guess you could say hasn't done, that leaves a lot to be desired. So starting off with his first pro is that he has made the Sharks a less one-dimensional hockey team. Under Peter DeBoer, it was a big thing for the Sharks. Essentially, their offensive strategy revolved around getting the puck to the point, or more specifically Brent Burns, and then taking a shot from that area to hope that someone like Joe Pavelski was in the vicinity to tip the puck into the net. However, with Brent Burns falling off a bit offensively, and of course Joe Pavelski ended up being signed by the Dallas Stars, that strategy did not work nearly as well at the beginning of the 1920 season, which was a primary reason why Peter DeBoer ended up getting fired. And with Bob Boughner taking over, he has transitioned the Sharks quite quickly away from a team that just a couple of years ago had one of the highest shot percentages from their defense, to this year where they have one of the lowest shot percentages coming from their defense, meaning their forwards have been taking a large percentage of the team's overall shots compared to their defensemen. And that actually goes hand in hand with this second pro, which is the fact that the Sharks have been able to generate more dangerous chances. Now, the point should be used usually by a team as a tool when you want to relieve pressure from down low. A lot of the times defensive players will collapse down low, and so you can get it to an empty point shot with some traffic in front or something like that. However, under Peter DeBoer, the Sharks were relying way too heavily on the points. This season, as I said, the forwards have been a lot more unlocked and a lot more free to really make chances for themselves. And so the Sharks have been generating much closer shots, much more dangerous shots from the slot, things like this. So much so that the Sharks actually ended up being fourth in the league this season in terms of high danger chances for. Now, you may wonder why that didn't convert directly into more goals for the San Jose Sharks. Well, the major problem is that the Sharks were third last in the league in terms of high danger chances shooting percentage. However, that's not so much a comment on Bob Boughner, as he can only do so much to get the players into a position to score, while it is on the players themselves to actually be able to put the puck in the net from those positions, which they just weren't really doing this season. But the fact that they're actually getting these opportunities has been a testament to how much Bob Boughner has been able to affect this team over this past year and a half, to really just do a full transition from the defense-centered offense of Peter DeBoer to the now forward-centered offense of Bob Boughner. And finally, the Sharks have also been a much more improved team off of the rush. Now, this point kind of goes both ways. A couple of years ago, when the Sharks were this dominant offensive force in the National Hockey League, they did not necessarily have to be all that fantastic off the rush. A lot of their chances came from just pressure in the offensive zone, as they were always able to sustain puck possession in the offensive zone to be able to set up chances like, of course, as I said, Burns to Pavelski in front for the tip. However, this season, the Sharks have been a significantly worse team than some of the other teams that they've been facing off against, like the Avalanche, like the Vegas Golden Knights. And as such, the Sharks have had to much more rely on their few and far between chances off of the rush. And so the fact that Bob Boughner has been able to recognize that is a situation that would occur and to capitalize on that is also a sort of feather in his cap. And so a lot of these pros have really revolved around the offensive game for the San Jose Sharks, that Bob Boughner has managed to undergo allow the Sharks to undergo this offensive transformation to make them a more solid team in that regard. The major problems, however, stem from, most of this happening at 5-on-5, and the fact that their defensive game has left a lot to be desired as well. Now, before I get into that, I should mention that a lot of people will take a look at these pros and cons and they'll say, well, in the end, it all comes down to the players. And that is absolutely true. In the end, the coach can really only give an outline for how he wants the team to play, and the players actually have to execute on that outline. And so you could have the best coach in the world, but if your players are awful, you're probably still going to end up last place in the league. However, the major problem with that comes from the fact that when it comes to actually changing the personnel of a team, it is significantly more difficult than it is to changing the coaching staff. When it comes to, let's just say, as an example, trying to get rid of a player like Marc-Edouard Vlasic, you have to first of all get him to actually waive that no movement clause that he has. Then you have to somehow find a team that wants a $7 million contract for the next millennia on their cap, in a flat cap world, and then you also have to deal with what the return would be, or I guess in Vlasic's situation, what kind of sweeteners you'd have to put into a deal like that to get a team to take a contract like Marc-Edouard Vlasic. Essentially, you have to jump through multiple hoops just to be able to get rid of a player like Vlasic in this situation, and that spreads to basically all of the big contracts on the Sharks: Burns, Karlsson, even players like Logan Couture as well. However, when it comes to the head coach, you can just sort of say, all right, goodbye, and fire him. There's no problem. There's no issue with the cap hit. You have to pay him, anyway, because you signed a contract, but it doesn't really affect your salary cap at that point, and you can just hire a different coach and be done with it. And so, yes, in the end, things do come down to the players themselves, to the personnel, but the coach has to put in a good system, and Bob Boughner, defensively at the very least, and with a couple of these other situations, has not necessarily done that. Because while I pointed out that the Sharks were 4th place in the league in terms of high danger chances for, they were also 5th place in the league in terms of high danger chances against. So while the Sharks were playing this high flying style of offensive hockey, that also left them very vulnerable to these offensive chances against themselves. And you could definitely tell by the eye test that this was definitely the case. While the goaltending for the San Jose Sharks was quite poor, the fact remains is that the defense definitely did not do them any favors in this regard this season. It felt like a lot of the times most of the Sharks players were extremely lost in the defensive zone, extremely confused in the defensive zone, and there was no real support happening. I cannot tell you how many times it happened that there would be a defenseman or even forward or someone like a winger down low in the Sharks defensive zone at the goal line, and instead of being able to actually orchestrate a strong breakout for the San Jose Sharks to get the puck out of the zone and not take an icing, I cannot tell you how many times the Sharks would end up just sending it all the way down the ice for an icing, which is sometimes okay, but usually not fantastic, or the Sharks would attempt to sort of just bank the puck out of the zone off the glass or off the boards and to kind of just hope for the best that the puck doesn't get kept in. And yet, a lot of the times, the puck would indeed get kept in, and the opposing team would end up continuing the pressure. There have been shifts even this season in which the Sharks have attempted to get the puck out of the zone through this kind of hope for the best strategy 3 or even 4 times in just a single shift, and the other team would be keeping it in each and every time and would end up scoring there. It just seems as though there's some sort of disconnect between the 5 players in the defensive zone for the San Jose Sharks, and Bob Boughner has not really done a very good job at sort of bringing it all together in that part of the game, which has been a big reason why the Sharks were not successful this season. Next con would be on the power play. The Sharks ended up finishing this season 29th in the league on the power play, only ahead of the lowly Detroit Red Wings and the historic low Anaheim Ducks. And the Sharks have just way too much talent that they can ice on their first and even second power plays to find themselves 29th in the league in terms of power play percentage. I'm not saying they should be top 5. I'm not saying they should be top 10. I'm not even necessarily saying they should be an above average team, as in, 16th or higher. I'm just saying that the fact that they're 29th is a massive comment on how their power play strategies have just not been working this season. It feels as though if the other team ends up winning a faceoff and getting the puck out of the zone, the Sharks take ages to just be able to re-enter. They consistently get stood up at the blue line by the opposing team's penalty kill. And even once they do get settled, it feels as though there's only like a 10 or 20% chance that the Sharks actually display a good amount of movement and actually get some good chances on net, compared to the 80 or even 90% chance that on their power play they kind of just pass it between Karlsson, Burns, and Couture up at the point, and after 30 seconds of just sort of doing absolutely nothing, they take a weak shot on net that either gets blocked or goes wide or is an easy save with zero traffic in front, and essentially the power plays amount to just being 2 minutes of literally nothing. Not even to mention the fact that there have been multiple power plays this season where the Sharks have actually had worse chances than the penalty killing team have had, as the Sharks have given up multiple shorthanded goals this season. The power play has just been defective and just not nearly good enough, even though the 5-on-5 game surprisingly has shown massive improvements offensively. And finally, let's talk about lineup choices here for Bob Boughner. There have been a few things that I have agreed with. I liked that when he inserted both Rudolf Balcers and Barabanov into the lineup, he gave them big opportunities to actually be able to perform, and those players really stepped up in those roles. However, there have been multiple other choices that I haven't agreed with, and none bigger than the handling of Ryan Donato this season. You take a look at the point scores for the San Jose Sharks, and leading the way, of course, is the 5 forwards who you would expect: Kane, Hurdle, Meyer, Couture, and LeBanc, and then of course the top 2 defensemen who are offensively gifted, like Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. But then who is 8th in terms of points for the San Jose Sharks? Well, it is none other than Ryan Donato, sitting at 20 points on the season, which is actually rather impressive because Donato has gotten very, very little time on ice this season, especially near the end, where he would be lucky to even be hitting the double digits in terms of minutes on the ice. And this is sort of strange because when it comes to the expected goals for, when you take a look at a more advanced stat, the expected goals for per 60, so basically a way at normalizing it compared to players who maybe don't get as much ice time together, Ryan Donato actually led the Sharks in terms of expected goals per 60 minutes, showing that he was an effective player in the offensive zone for the San Jose Sharks. And yet Bob Boughner recently, in the past few days, has given a comment of if Ryan Donato is to stay with the San Jose Sharks, he needs to learn how to play the right way, which, by the way, is just an extremely vague way of putting literally anything, because you could attribute literally anything to that. However, obviously it seems to be mentioning somewhere his defensive style of game, which obviously it can use some improvement. Ryan Donato is not the best defensive player in the NHL. He will never win a Frank J. Selke, but he certainly isn't too bad, and he certainly isn't at, worse than some of the other players that the Sharks have iced consistently this season. I mean, Timo Meier has been at times a disaster defensively this season, and obviously there have been some, consequences for that, but in the end, Meier has still managed to maintain a pretty, solid spot in the lineup. A player like Patrick Marlowe was never, even in his heyday, was never really a fantastic defensive forward, in my opinion. And this season, obviously, you were never going to bench Patrick Marlowe, but you could definitely reduce the ice time somewhat, because I don't think Marlowe was necessarily all that effective defensively, and yet he consistently got not only solid ice time, but even promotions up in the lineup to a point where he was the second line center for the last few games of the season, with Logan Couture injured. And yet, with Ryan Donato, I always felt as though he was frequently doing the right things. He found himself in the right positions. There was one specific goal. It was against the Anaheim Ducks. Ryan Getzlaf ended up scoring, and Ryan Donato was the guy who was supposed to be covering Ryan Getzlaf, and he actually was on him. It's just Ryan Donato was not a strong enough player and was unable to outmuscle Getzlaf and prevent him from getting his stick on the puck to actually be able to score. But just the fact that Donato is in the position to potentially interfere with that and prevent that offensive chance, or that offensive chance, is a good sign compared to some of the other Sharks players who wouldn't have even back-checked and been in the position to even prevent that opportunity. And so it's been Ryan Donato, the fact that he has just not had gotten much ice time, but also a lot of the other players. For instance, in the past few games of this season, the Sharks were playing absolutely meaningless games. The Sharks had zero chance of making it to the Stanley Cup playoffs, and so you might as well get some looks at some of these younger players. And Bob Boughner was doing a good job of putting them in the lineup, but he wasn't doing a particularly good job at actually getting them time on ice. I remember there was one specific game where Chekovich ended up getting something like 7 or 8 minutes of time on ice in a game that is essentially meaningless, because I guess he wasn't playing well enough in a game that, again, meant absolutely nothing. And so I know Evander Kane has been so good this season, but does he really still need to be getting over 20 minutes of time on ice in the last couple of games when players like Shemelevsky, Chekovich, who can be a part of the fabric of this team for the next few seasons, when these players are getting less than 10 minutes of time on ice? I just don't necessarily agree. And so after having gone through this pro and cons list, do I think Bob Boughner should be fired for next season? Well, it really is in the end going to depend on what the Sharks' plans are for the next season. Do they actually want to try and compete and get back to the playoffs next season? Is that something that they want to do? Because considering the fact that they took a big hit financially this season due to the COVID situation, not being able to have any fans in the stands, and it's looking as though next season will be a return to normalcy, it's very possible that the Sharks brass as a whole, the front office, the owner, Hasso-Plattner, wants the Sharks to make that push to the playoffs to try and drive up revenue. If the Sharks do want that to happen, I would suggest absolutely firing Bob Boughner and trying to pick up maybe one of the more experienced coaches who is available. Someone like Gerard Gallant, who was once a strong coach with the Florida Panthers and, of course, most recently, a very good coach with the Vegas Golden Knights. Or even someone more controversial like John Tortorella, whose contract has run out with the Columbus Blue Jackets and whose contract will not be renewed by this Blue Jackets team this season. I feel as though a coach like Tortorella being brought into the Sharks for maybe a year or two max could definitely do something to whip this team into shape and maybe even bring them back to the playoffs. On the other hand, if the Sharks are okay with this whole retooling/rebuilding phase that they are currently undergoing, and so they want to be able to get as many top draft picks over the next couple of years as possible, it is probably in their best interest to just retain Bob Boughner as their head coach, give him that full training camp, give him that full preseason to see, can he, bring this team around, turn it around? And if not, it's really not the end of the world if he can't do so. So it's really all going to depend on how the Sharks are looking at things, how Doug Wilson is looking at things for next season, but it's definitely a possibility that he is gone for the next year. Class dismissed.